Part 1: The Arrival at Deveraux Manor. The autumn of 1862 crept over Connecticut like a dying ember, casting the countryside in shades of rust and smoke. The war had drained the land, leaving villages hollow and hungry, and yet one name still carried whispers of plenty: the Deveraux. They were said to live untouched by famine or fear, their estate hidden deep within the fog-choked hills near Ashbrook Hollow. When word reached Thomas Granger, a young journalist known for chasing the strange and the unspoken, he felt the pull of curiosity stronger than reason. An invitation arrived the following week, written in elegant cursive upon thick ivory paper, sealed with crimson wax. "Join us for a night of remembrance," it read. No signature, only a date and an address few locals dared to mention aloud. The journey began beneath a sky heavy with mist. Thomas traveled by carriage through winding forest roads, where the trees leaned close as if listening. The air carried the scent of wet soil and something faintly metallic like rust or blood. The driver refused to go beyond the old stone bridge that marked the boundary of the Deveraux land. "No further," the man muttered, eyes wide and unblinking. "The woods beyond, they don't forgive trespass." Left alone, lantern in hand, Thomas pressed onward on foot. Each step sank into the damp earth, and the silence grew thicker. Even the crickets seemed to have abandoned this place. When the manor came into view, it seemed less a home and more a monument to something that refused to die. The structure rose from the mist like a carcass of stone and wood, its once white columns stained black with rain and time. Ivy crawled across its face like veins. The windows glowed faintly amber, though no smoke rose from the chimneys. As Thomas drew closer, the faint sound of a piano carried through the fog, a slow, sorrowful waltz played by unseen hands. At the great iron gate, a figure awaited him. The butler, or what appeared to be one, was tall and thin, with skin the color of old parchment. His eyes glimmered with polite indifference as he said, "Mr. Granger, the family has been expecting you." His voice carried no warmth, only precision. Without another word, he turned and led Thomas up the cobblestone path. The closer they came, the stronger the smell became, a strange blend of roasted meat, sweet wine, and something faintly decayed beneath it all. The doors opened before they even reached them, revealing a vast hall bathed in the light of hundreds of candles. Every surface gleamed with age-old wealth. Portraits in gilded frames, marble floors polished to a mirror's sheen, chandeliers that dripped with crystal tears. Yet beneath the splendor lurked something off-kilter. The air was too cold, the silence too careful. As Thomas stepped inside, the doors closed behind him with a sound that felt final. From the grand staircase descended the Deveraux family. Lucien Deveraux, the patriarch, was tall, commanding, with sharp cheekbones and eyes that seemed to absorb the light. His wife, Marguerite, followed, graceful as a shadow. Behind them came their children, 3 of them, though none looked quite natural. Their beauty was immaculate but distant, like statues carved too perfectly. "Mr. Granger," Lucien said with a smile that did not reach his eyes, "it is an honor to have an observer among us. Tonight, we dine in remembrance of those who made our prosperity possible." Thomas bowed slightly, his throat dry. "I'm grateful for the invitation, Mr. Deveraux. Your hospitality is renowned." The patriarch chuckled softly. "Oh, it is not hospitality, my boy. It is tradition." They guided him into the dining hall, where a table stretched nearly the length of the room. Silverware gleamed, and platters of food steamed beneath heavy lids. The scents were intoxicating: spices, roasted meats, wines aged longer than memory. Yet something about the dishes unsettled him. The cuts were too irregular, the sauces too thick and red, as if meant to disguise their origins. The guests, neighbors, distant cousins, faces pale and unfamiliar, spoke in low tones, their words laced with strange phrases: the offering, the cycle, the hunger sated. When the first course was served, Thomas raised his glass in polite mimicry, though his appetite had vanished. The wine was rich, almost syrupy, and carried an aftertaste of iron. He glanced around. Every other guest drank deeply, eyes closed in quiet ecstasy. Lucien lifted his goblet and said softly, "To remembrance." The words rippled through the room as everyone repeated them. "To remembrance." A faint unease crawled up Thomas's spine. He couldn't tell if the candles were dimming or if the shadows were growing stronger, but the room felt smaller now, closer, as though the walls themselves were leaning in to listen. He turned to one of the guests beside him, a frail woman with silver hair and sunken eyes. "Forgive me," he whispered. "Whose remembrance do we honor tonight?" She smiled weakly, her lips trembling as she replied, "Ours, of course. Those who were chosen keep us whole." Before he could ask what she meant, The butler appeared behind him, refilling his glass. The man's hand brushed his sleeve, cold as stone. As the feast continued, the piano resumed its mournful tune somewhere in the manor's depths. Between courses, Lucien spoke of legacy, of gratitude, of survival. "When the world starved, we endured," he said, his voice carrying a strange reverence. "And so we remember those who gave themselves so that we might never know hunger again." The guests applauded softly, their eyes glimmering in the candlelight. Thomas forced a smile, but his heart pounded in his chest. Something was terribly wrong. Every instinct screamed that he should leave, yet curiosity chained him to his seat. When the final dish was brought out, a grand silver platter shrouded in steam, Lucien rose. "Our guest of honor shall serve the first portion," he said, gesturing toward Thomas. The butler presented him with a carving knife, its handle engraved with symbols Thomas didn't recognize. The scent wafting from the dish was thick and sweet, nearly suffocating. He hesitated, then lifted the lid. What lay beneath was not a roast. It was something smaller, human-shaped, wrapped in herbs and cloth. The eyes sewn shut. The mouth twisted in what looked like a final scream. A silence fell so complete it seemed the air itself stopped moving. Thomas's hand trembled as Lucien's voice broke the stillness. Calm, patient, absolute. To remember, one must partake. And in that moment, Thomas understood that the Deveraux feast was no mere celebration. It was a covenant, one fed by flesh, sealed by silence, and passed from generation to generation in blood. Part 2: The Guest Who Never Left, 1862, Connecticut. The dinner was meant to be a celebration, a lavish gathering of old friends and neighboring families to mark the harvest season. Inside the grand Deveraux mansion, light spilled through stained glass, casting crimson and amber patterns across the long dining table. Silverware gleamed, crystal glasses caught the firelight, and the scent of roasted venison, buttered rolls, and wine filled the air. From the outside, it seemed the Deveraux were the picture of prosperity, but the truth beneath that feast was something far darker. Eleanor Deveraux moved through the room like a phantom of grace. Her smile was flawless, her voice soft, her posture perfect. But those who looked closely would have noticed the faint tremor in her hand as she poured the wine. Her husband, Alaric Deveraux, sat at the head of the table, a man of strong presence but sunken eyes, the kind that spoke of sleepless nights. The guests chatted about weather, crops, and politics, blissfully unaware that the meat they praised so highly didn't come from any hunt or butcher in town. The Deveraux servants avoided eye contact with the guests, moving quickly, efficiently, as if afraid of lingering too long near the food. In the kitchen, a single pot remained simmering on the stove, a heavy iron cauldron filled with a thick, dark broth. If anyone had looked closely, they would have noticed something unusual about the bones soaking within it. But no one dared. In the Deveraux home, questions were not welcomed. Midway through the feast, the laughter began to falter. One by one, the guests grew pale, their eyes glassy, their smiles fixed but wrong. A chill seemed to crawl along the table, and the air grew heavy, thick with something unspoken. Eleanor's hands clutched her napkin tightly, and for a fleeting second, her gaze met her husband's, a look of quiet dread. Then the grandfather clock struck 8. Its chime echoed unnaturally long, like it was tolling for a funeral instead of dinner. Alaric rose slowly from his seat, raising his glass in a toast. "To abundance," he said, voice low and hollow. "To family. To the feast." His words hung in the air like a curse. That was the last sound the guests remembered before everything went black. When the sheriff came the next morning, alerted by a stable boy who'd seen no one leave the mansion, he found the dining hall perfectly set, plates half filled, candles still burning low. The chairs were pushed in neatly, all but one. The seat at the head of the table was empty, and the remains of the feast were cold. The Deveraux were nowhere to be found. No footprints led from the house, no carriages departed in the night. But in the cellar, beneath the marble floor, officers discovered fresh earth, and something buried hastily beneath it. They didn't dig deep before the smell forced them back out into the cold morning air. Whatever had been in that grave was not meant for human eyes. The house was sealed off. The town buried the story as best they could. But every harvest season since, locals swore they could see faint candlelight flickering in the Deveraux dining hall, and silhouettes moving behind the glass, frozen in an endless toast to a feast that should never have happened. Part 3: The Cellar Beneath the Feast, 1862, Connecticut. When the town sheriff returned to the Deveraux mansion 2 nights later, the air around the estate felt heavier, like the fog itself had grown thicker to guard its secrets. The once proud house loomed against the horizon, its tall windows dark, its grand columns streaked with rain. Though he was accompanied by 2 deputies, the sheriff couldn't shake the sense that they were intruding upon something that hadn't yet finished unfolding. The front door creaked open with a sound too human, almost like a sigh. The scent of rot and old wine wafted out to meet them. Inside, the air was still. Every glass and plate from the feast remained in place, untouched, though a layer of dust had already begun to settle. The fire had long gone out, yet faint warmth seemed to hum through the walls, as though the house still remembered the night of the gathering. They descended into the cellar after an hour of searching the upper floors. The sheriff's boots echoed off the stone steps, each one heavier than the last. The air grew damp, cooler, and the scent intensified, something metallic like iron and decay. At the bottom, the flicker of their lantern revealed a vast chamber that seemed far larger than the foundation should have allowed. Rows of old wine barrels lined one wall, and in the center stood a long wooden table, its surface scarred with deep cuts. The walls were covered in strange carvings, old symbols that no one in the room recognized. But the strangest thing of all was the floor. It was uneven, a patch of dirt recently turned, as if someone had tried to bury something in haste. The sheriff motioned for the deputies to dig. They hesitated, but fear of his stare drove them forward. Their shovels struck the earth, and after only a few scoops, the first thing they uncovered was a piece of fabric. A sleeve still clinging to an arm. The sheriff stepped back, lantern trembling in his hand. Beneath that patch of dirt lay what remained of the guests, or at least parts of them. Some were recognizable by their clothing, but their faces were twisted, contorted, mouths frozen open as if screaming when the earth covered them. One of the deputies dropped his shovel and retched. Another whispered a prayer. But it wasn't the bodies that unsettled the sheriff most. It was what they found beneath them. At the very bottom of the pit, under layers of soil and bone, was a wooden lid, carved with the same symbols that lined the walls. They pulled it open, and the air that rushed out was colder than the night above. Inside lay something that wasn't quite human. Its form was long and pale, limbs too thin, skin stretched like wax. Where its eyes should have been were hollow sockets, yet it felt like it was staring straight at them. A faint sound echoed through the chamber, like breathing but too slow, too deliberate. The sheriff stumbled backward, heart hammering. He ordered the cellar sealed and the mansion locked, but as they climbed the stairs, a sound followed them, the faint scrape of wood against stone. One deputy swore he saw the cellar door shift as if something had pushed it from below. None of them looked back. That night, the sheriff wrote a report describing the scene but omitted the final discovery. He claimed the guests were victims of poisoning, that the Deveraux had fled, that the cellar contained only tools and barrels. But those who knew him said he never slept again without a light burning by his bed. Weeks passed and strange things began happening around the estate. Livestock near the Deveraux property were found mutilated, bones stripped clean, eyes missing. Travelers along the road claimed they saw figures moving inside the mansion at night, though no lamps were ever lit. The sheriff tried to ignore the stories, but one evening he received a letter written in fine, trembling script. There was no name, only a single sentence: "The feast is not over." He returned once more, alone this time. The sky was blood red at sunset when he reached the property. He found the cellar door exactly as they'd left it, sealed shut. But as he stepped closer, he noticed something beneath it. Small piles of fresh dirt as if from digging below. The lock was broken from the inside. He hesitated, hand hovering above the latch, before lifting it open. The stench that met him was unbearable. Inside, the cellar was different. The walls had changed. The carvings had multiplied, twisting across the stone like veins, pulsing faintly in the light. And there, on the long wooden table, lay the remains of another meal. 3 plates, 3 chairs, and a fourth, empty one waiting at the head. In the center of the table sat the sheriff's own badge. He hadn't realized he'd dropped it, yet there it was, glinting in the lantern's glow. His breath caught as he heard footsteps behind him, soft, deliberate, coming down the stairs. He turned, but the light flickered out before he could see. The last thing he remembered was the faint whisper that seemed to crawl from the darkness, a woman's voice, gentle and cold: "Sit. You're just in time." When the mansion was finally torn down decades later, locals said the ground beneath it was hollow, a warren of tunnels that led nowhere, filled with fragments of glass, porcelain, and bone. Every harvest, the soil would loosen as if breathing. Some swore that on windless nights, they could still hear the faint clinking of cutlery and the soft murmur of conversation rising from beneath the earth. The Deveraux were never found, but their name lived on in whispers. Farmers refused to till the land. Children dared each other to touch the old iron gate. No one stayed there after dark. Because everyone in that small Connecticut town knew the same unspoken truth. The feast had never ended. It merely waited, patient and hungry for new guests to arrive. Part 4: The Return of the Feast, 1862, Connecticut. By the time autumn crept over the hills of Asheville, the Deveraux mansion had become a ruin in all but name. The ivy had strangled the outer walls, windows shattered from storms, and the scent of earth and decay clung to the house like a curse. Yet despite the years of silence, the villagers could not escape its presence. They said the air around the estate always felt colder, the birds never sang near its trees, and sometimes at dusk the faint glow of candlelight would shimmer in the upper windows, even though no one had lived there for decades. Then one night, a young historian named Elias Warren arrived from Hartford. He had heard the stories of the forbidden feast, of the vanished guests and the cellar that was sealed, and he wanted to document it all for his book on America's unholy architecture. The locals warned him. The innkeeper refused to rent him a lantern. But Elias was stubborn, a man of reason, and he believed the Deveraux story was nothing more than myth, a collection of frightened memories twisted by generations. He reached the mansion just as the sun was setting, its silhouette stretching long and thin across the dying grass. Inside, the air was dense, almost humid despite the chill. He lit his candle and wandered through the halls, taking notes. Portraits lined the walls, faded faces of men and women whose eyes seemed to follow him as he passed. The grand dining room stood exactly as described in old records. The long mahogany table still intact, the chairs arranged as though waiting for guests. Dust blanketed everything except the center of the table, where faint circular marks suggested that plates had been there recently. Elias ran his finger over one of the impressions and frowned. The surface was warm. He shook it off and made his way to the cellar. The door resisted when he tried to open it, the hinges groaning like something trapped. When it finally gave way, a rush of air struck his face, not the damp, stale air of an old basement, but the breath of something living, something deep and steady. His candle sputtered but did not die. He descended the stairs. The cellar was just as the sheriff's old report had described, though now the walls seemed to pulse faintly as if they were alive. Symbols carved long ago glistened with a wet sheen as though freshly etched. Elias set down his bag and knelt beside the uneven floor. He brushed away dirt, finding traces of bone, then something metallic, the edge of a spoon. He frowned, noting its ornate handle engraved with the Deveraux crest. He lifted it, and as he did, he felt a vibration in the ground. Not an earthquake, something slower like a heartbeat. The candlelight flickered violently, shadows stretching across the walls. Elias turned toward the table. It was no longer empty. 3 plates had appeared. Steam rose from them, though no fire burned in the room. The scent of roasted meat and sweet wine filled the air, intoxicating and nauseating at once. He stumbled back, eyes wide, as he heard faint voices whispering, polite conversation, laughter, the sound of cutlery on porcelain. But there were no figures. Only the imprints of bodies in the chairs, like the memory of those who once sat there. He turned and fled for the stairs, but the steps had changed, longer, spiraling downward instead of up. His candle blew out. Elias didn't remember falling, but when he opened his eyes, he was no longer in the cellar. He was seated at the table. The plates were full, the wine glasses brimming, and across from him sat the faint outlines of people, silhouettes that shimmered in the air, their faces hidden by veils of smoke. One of them, a woman in a tattered gown, leaned forward. Her eyes were hollow, glowing faintly from within. "Eat," she whispered. "You were invited." Elias tried to speak, to protest, but no sound came out. His hands trembled. The knife and fork before him gleamed as though newly polished. The smell of the meat turned his stomach. It was metallic, raw beneath the surface. The woman's voice echoed again, soft but commanding. "Those who sit must not leave hungry." He pushed the plate away, but the whispering around him grew sharper, angrier. The temperature dropped. Shadows thickened until the room vanished entirely. Then came the sound, that slow, steady heartbeat rising from beneath the floorboards. Something shifted under the table. Elias stood and ran toward where the stairs should have been, but there was only a wall of stone. Desperation took hold. He slammed his fists against it, shouting, "Let me out!" The laughter stopped. In the silence that followed, a voice spoke from behind him, low, ancient, and familiar. "We've waited a long time for another historian." When searchers from the nearby village finally reached the mansion 3 days later, they found his journal near the cellar door. It ended mid-sentence, the ink smeared as though written in haste. There was no sign of Elias himself, only his hat resting neatly on the table in the grand dining hall. The pages of his journal smelled faintly of smoke and iron. In the weeks that followed, travelers began avoiding the road that passed the Deveraux estate. Those who did cross near it at night claimed they saw candlelight through the windows again, a flicker of orange and gold moving from room to room. Some even swore they heard music, violins tuning, laughter echoing faintly through the hills. And if one stood close enough to the gate, they could hear it too, the muffled clink of glasses, the rustle of silk gowns, and a single haunting phrase drifting on the wind. You were invited. Part 5. The feast never ended. 1862 Connecticut. The townsfolk of Asheville thought they had heard the last of the Deveraux after Elias Warren vanished. The mansion was sealed once again, its gates locked by the sheriff, though no one dared enter to ensure the deed was done. They told themselves that the place was cursed, yes, but only in memory, a ghost of a sin long past. Yet as the years turned to decades, something about the Deveraux estate refused to die. On moonless nights, faint lights still flickered through its windows, as if the house itself remembered. By 1903, the story had turned into a whispered warning for children. Don't wander near Hollow Creek, parents would say, or the Deveraux will invite you to dinner. Few took it seriously until the Hollow Creek orphanage fire, when 3 survivors, all children, were found wandering near the Deveraux property barefoot, their mouths stained dark red. They couldn't recall their names. The only words any of them spoke were, "The table was full." No one knew what it meant. The town priest, Father Samuel Doran, took this as a divine sign, that something unholy was still festering there. He gathered a small group of men and set out toward the mansion on All Hallows Eve. They brought crosses, salt, and torches, and though they walked under a clear sky, every man claimed the light dimmed as they neared the gates. The moment they crossed the threshold, the air grew heavy, pressing against their lungs like deep water. Inside, the mansion appeared as though it had been cleaned. The chandeliers gleamed, candles burned, and the long dining table stood adorned with polished silverware and platters that glowed faintly from within. Yet no one had touched this house for over 40 years. Father Samuel felt his faith quiver as he approached the table. There were 11 chairs, not 10 as in the original report. The 12th, at the head, remained empty, its cushion untouched by dust. The men split up to search the house. Some explored the upper floors, where portraits of the Deveraux family had been restored. In each painting, however, the faces were blank, the features scraped clean, leaving smooth, pale ovals where eyes and mouths should have been. Others went to the cellar, where they found the same sigils Elias had described, but they were glowing now, breathing faintly with the pulse of something beneath. Father Samuel stood at the table, reading a verse aloud. His voice trembled as the candle flames flickered backward, drawn toward him instead of away. The air began to hum, low and resonant. He called for his men, but their footsteps above had stopped. He turned toward the staircase and froze. A figure stood there, a woman in a crimson gown, her hands clasped as though in prayer. Her face was hidden behind a lace veil, but her voice was unmistakably human when she said, "You shouldn't have come hungry." The torches went out. Darkness filled the room, and with it came sound, not from one direction but from all around. The creak of chairs, the clink of glasses, the faint murmur of conversation. The feast had begun again. Father Samuel tried to flee, but the floorboards beneath him softened, his shoes sinking into something warm and wet. He looked down, the wood had become flesh. The table pulsed as though it had veins, and from the corners of the room, shadowed forms took shape, drifting toward the table. The woman in red lifted her veil. Her mouth stretched far wider than human, her teeth black and glistening. Behind her, others appeared, the Deveraux themselves or what remained of them, their skin pale as wax, their eyes hollow. They smiled at Father Samuel as if greeting an old friend. "Join us," the matriarch whispered. "Our faith endures through flesh." When dawn came, the Deveraux estate was silent again. The torches and holy symbols lay scattered in the yard, but none of the men returned. Only Father Samuel's rosary was found, fused into the wood of the front door as though melted there. After that, the town finally stopped speaking of the Deveraux altogether. The mansion was left to rot, consumed by vines and silence. But silence does not mean peace. In 1938, a team of archaeologists surveying the valley uncovered a hidden tunnel system beneath the mansion. It was not listed in any property record. Deep within, they found remnants of what appeared to be a ritual chamber, and a long table carved from bone. Most unsettling were the markings etched into the ceiling. "The feast is eternal." None of the archaeologists returned for the second survey. Their notes, recovered from the camp, contained sketches of 11 figures seated in a circle, the same number of chairs the priest had found, with one space left open at the head of the table. And though the house has long since collapsed, those who pass near the ruins claim to hear the faint toll of a dinner bell beneath the earth, followed by the sound of silver clinking against porcelain. The legend says that every 50 years the Deveraux rise again, inviting one soul, just one, to complete their feast. No one knows who will be chosen next, but if you ever smell roast meat near Hollow Creek with no fire nearby, don't look toward the mansion, because the feast still waits, and the Deveraux are always hungry.